the review's editor-in-chief. And when the latter died in 1925, he became one of the leading contributing editors and used the reviews as a forum to publish his essays on Proust and others. In 1927, he started publishing the Cahiers Marcel Proust, a journal devoted to critical texts on the novelist. In the mid-1930s, Ramon's prolific literary production came to a sudden stop. As political tensions mounted in Europe and France, and Europe headed towards another war, the young critic got caught in the whirlwind of pre-war politics. At first, as we might expect if we think of all of the things that he had done, he started out as a committed anti-fascist and anti-Stalinist. But in 1937, he veered to the right and joined Jacques Doriot's Parti Populaire Français, which was an ultra-nationalist, anti-communist, and pro-fascist party that would end up collaborating with the Germans during the occupation of Paris. And one journalist writing about the sudden shift in the politics of Ramon Fernandez wrote, quote, "He is very nice, Monsieur Ramon Fernandez, but he doesn't seem to know what he wants." End quote. In 1941, Fernandez, along with Pierre Drieux-La Rochelle and Robert Brasillac, joined the delegation of French intellectuals who traveled to Weimar, where they were received by Goebbels. Ramon Fernandez returned to Paris full of enthusiasm for Nazi Germany and published several articles praising, quote, the meeting of Maréchal Pétain and Chancellor Hitler, end quote, as leading to a new reality that could and should make a new Europe. Ironically, it seems that it was his love of French culture that drew Ramon Fernandez to the far right. At a time when Western civilization was under threat, he naively chose the party that most vociferously defended European culture. This unfortunate choice puts him in the company of other Latin American intellectuals, from José Vasconcelos to Honorio Delgado, whose admiration for German culture led them to support Nazism. Unlike Borges, who eloquently argued that he opposed Nazism precisely because he loved German culture. And there's some very interesting articles by Borges published during the war where he comes out as a Germanophile and anti-Nazi, and criticizes the general tendency that he saw in his country to ally Germanophilia with Nazism. So now, you can see that he's a fascinating figure. And I'm very interested in the question of, well, what did it mean to be a Mexican Nazi, or at least a Mexican Nazi sympathizer in France during the occupation? And what does this mean for wider reflections on Mexican identity? It's actually a little bit more complicated. So let me, if I can, let me read you a few more details about Fernandez's life. Despite his allegiance to this far-right party, Ramon did not embrace the extreme right's anti-Semitism. In the early 30s, he had been a critic of Céline's portrayal of the Jews, and he renewed his objections in 1938 in an article on Bagatelle pour un massacre. During the occupation, his attitude was more ambivalent. One finds traces of anti-Semitic sentiment in his articles, but at the same time, he championed writers who would have been considered degenerate by the Nazis. He published an homage to Bergson when he died in 1941, and he was actually one of the very few intellectuals in Paris who dared make an homage to a thinker that was Jewish in 1941. And in 1943, Ramon published Proust, a monograph that summed up his views on the novel, which had been one of his crucial influences on his views on literature. Dominique Fernandez, his son and biographer, considers this last publication on a half-Jewish homosexual writer as an act of defiance against the Germans. The critic Simon Epstein has summed up Ramon's French paradox, as he calls it, by labeling him, quote, an anti-racist collaborator. And it's very interesting. So what Epstein does is he decouples collaboration from anti-Semitism. And he shows that there were some collaborators who were anti-racist, and there were some people in the resistance who were anti-Semitic. So it helps complicate the the scene in Paris in 1940. Now, another person who wrote about Ramon Fernandez was Marguerite Duras, who actually lived in the same building as him during the war, and who joined the resistance during the occupation, and who managed to remain friends with Ramon and his wife Betty, even though they were on opposite ends of the political spectrum. And in her novel L'Amant, The Lover, Marguerite Duras offers the following recollection on their friendship. Quote, "We didn't talk politics. We talked about literature. Ramon Fernandez used to talk about Balzac. We could have listened to him for hours. He had a sublime courtesy, even in knowledge, a way at once profound and clear of handling knowledge without ever making it seem an obligation or a burden. He was sincere. It was always a joy to meet him in the street or in a cafe." End quote. And what's most fascinating is that even in retrospect, writing in the 1980s, Duras does not see their political views as entirely incompetent. She writes, quote, "Collaborators the Fernandezes were. And I, 2 years after the war, I was a member of the French Communist Party. The parallel is complete and absolute. The two things are the same pity, the same call for help, the same lack of judgment, the same superstition, if you like, that consists in believing in a political solution to the personal problems." End quote. So this is quite extraordinary. Marguerite Duras, writing in the 80s, looking back and basically saying, Ramon Fernandez was a collaborator, I was in the resistance, I was a communist, the two things are the same. We were the same kind of person. So after the war was drawing to a close, Ramon's health declined quickly. He slid into alcoholism, suffered from chronic illnesses, and appears to have drank himself to death. In 1944, as an Allied victory seemed imminent, he died of a stroke in Paris. His premature death, he was only 50 years old, spared him the harsh punishments given to most French intellectuals who collaborated with the Germans. Some, like Brasillac, were sentenced to death, others were sent to prison, and yet others, like Céline, faced a lifetime of public scorn. But not Fernandez, because he died just before these trials began. But actually, I think the unofficial punishment in France was oblivion. Before Dominique Fernandez, his son, who is gay and has been very engaged in leftist causes, including the defense of gay marriage, before he published a biography of his father in the 90s, no one really remembered Fernandez except as a collaborator. But all of his work on Proust, on philosophy, on the connection between philosophy and literature had been forgotten. So in many ways, his punishment was oblivion. It's a very Borgesian type of punishment, one can imagine. I think, let me see, maybe very quickly, I have a section on how Ramon Fernandez was read by Latin Americans. Let me run through it very, very quickly, and then I will conclude. So now, in his biography, Dominique Fernandez is quite harsh on his father, on Ramon Fernandez, and one of his complaints, or one of his criticisms, is that even though Ramon Fernandez was such a brilliant critic, who published so much about literature, who wrote about Gilles, about English literature, who was bilingual, spoke English perfectly, even though he had this brilliant trajectory, he never wrote one line about Mexico or Mexican literature. So Dominique sees this as a something that bothers him in his father's biography. And while that's true, it is true that Ramon Fernandez never wrote about Mexico, Mexican intellectuals were fascinated by him. And the first person to meet him was Alfonso Reyes, who, when he had been named Mexican ambassador to Paris in the 1920s, heard somewhere that there was this Mexican running around who had been friends with Proust. And Alfonso Reyes was fascinated by this, so he went and tried to meet this Mexican that no one in Mexico had heard of, and tried to engage him in conversation about his friendship with Proust, about his work on Proust, and then tried to actually bring him back to Mexico by publishing his work in Mexico. So the in a letter from 1928, Alfonso Reyes writes to Ramón Fernández, "Give me the pleasure of sending me a long autobiographical letter, including all the information you consider appropriate for supplementing your biography. If you could include a few Mexican souvenirs, either direct impressions from your own childhood or family memories, as well as a brief statement of your position towards philosophy and literature, as you understand it, I could translate your letter. I plan to send it to Contemporáneos, and it will be published as a short piece, not at all pretentious, but rather warm and friendly, on Ramón Fernández, the French writer for Mexico. Perhaps a photo? Don't say no, I beg you. And don't say mañana. Say right away." So this is quite symptomatic. You can see Alfonso Reyes really wanting to claim Ramón Fernández for Mexican culture. Just basically rolling out the red carpet, saying, please, you can be published. I can preface you. You will be a great figure in Mexico. Well, of course, Ramón, as one might expect after we have heard about him, never wrote the autobiographical sketch requested by Reyes, but he did send him a piece for Contemporáneos, an essay on Proust, adapted from one of the chapters in Messages. It was translated into Spanish by Javier Villaurrutia, who published it as Notas sobre la Estética de Proust in the March 1930 issue of Contemporáneos. Now, most of the other avant-garde writers who were associated with this journal, Contemporáneos, were equally fascinated by the figure of Ramón Fernández. Like Reyes, they were intrigued by his Mexicanness, but above all, they admired him as a critic who had written on Proust, Gide, T.S. Eliot, the very modern figures they admired and published in the pages of Contemporáneos. So in many ways, for them, this was a dream come true. Salvador Novo, Villaurrutia, and many of these other writers had spent years translating T.S. Eliot, writing about T.S. Eliot, thinking about Proust. And suddenly there was this Mexican in Paris who was almost like an agent that was in direct contact with all of this. So all of them wrote about him. In one of his first weekly columns for El Universal Ilustrado, Salvador Novo reviewed the first issue of the Cahiers Marcel Proust, edited by Ramón, and speculated on the curious identity of this connational. Ramón Fernández, he wrote, is Mexican, the son or grandson of a politician who served in the Porfiriato and who was thrown out of Mexico by the Revolution for the benefit of French letters. Monsieur Ramón Fernández does not speak or write in Spanish. In this, he is like George Santayana, the Spaniard who writes and thinks exclusively in English. Well, maybe I'll skip quickly over this section, but Novo wrote about him, Villaurrutia wrote about him, they published him in Contemporáneos, and not only in Mexico, many other Latin Americans were quite fascinated with him. Sur, the journal in Buenos Aires, directed by Silvina and Victorio Campo, published the Spanish version of one of Ramón's books, L'Homme est-il humain, translated by Isaac Ungar. Borges actually reviewed this book in the same journal, in Sur, and did not like it. He wrote, El procedimiento polémico, el único procedimiento polémico de este libro no adolece de mucha complejidad. Se limita cómodamente a deformar o simplificar las tesis del adversario para luego probar lo simples y deformes que son. So what could we conclude? What did all of these Mexican and Latin American writers make of Ramón and of his lack of interest in their literature? Most had mixed feelings. For example, Reyes admired his criticism and his friendship with Proust, but deplored his attitude towards Latin America. In an essay from the 1920s, Reyes recalled with affection the first time he met Ramón Fernández in Paris. He had just moved to the French capital to take his post at the embassy, and he found himself living at 44 Rue Hamelin, in the same building where Marcel Proust had spent the last 3 years of his life. Reyes befriended the concierge, who told him many stories about the eccentric novelist, his daily routine, and his illustrious visitors. Reyes learned then that Proust received frequent visits from Ramón Fernández, a Mexican writer who studied in Paris and was a descendant of President Manuel González's ambassador to France. The concierge's description sparked his interest, and he sought out his mysterious Mexican Proustian, unknown to Mexico. But actually, even Reyes, later, in the 50s, wrote quite harsh lines about Ramón Fernández, and he basically said this is someone who turned his back to Latin America and who wrote terrible things about Latin America, a continent he did not deem civilized. And then he has a quote from Ramón Fernández. Well, there's lots more to say about Ramón Fernández. As you can see, he's a fascinating figure. I think one could do a whole seminar on him and what he means for Mexican culture. But to conclude this brief presentation, I would just like to return to some of the questions that I posed when I began this talk. What are the limits of Mexican identity? And how do the experiences of Antonio Lagándara, Proust's Mexican painter, and Ramón Fernández, Proust's Mexican critic, invite us to rethink standard assumptions about Mexicanness in the early 20th century? We have grown very comfortable thinking about Mexican identity in terms of the usual cast of characters of post-revolutionary Mexico City. José Vasconcelos, Samuel Ramos, Octavio Paz, even the painters Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, etc., etc. But what happens to the debate on the particularities of Mexican identity when we expand the context in order to include Mexicans born in France who never set foot in Mexico, but which nevertheless remained Mexican citizens, as was the case for both Lagándara and Fernández? And how does the existence of a Mexican Nazi, or to be more precise, a Mexican Nazi sympathizer, trouble our notions of Mexican identity? We have grown used to thinking of the various attempts to theorize Mexicanness in the 1920s and 1930s as politically progressive. But, as some recent work on José Vasconcelos' totalitarian sympathies during World War II has made clear, some constructions of Mexicanness could be as monolithic and as potentially dangerous as constructions of Aryan purity. I see my efforts here in posing these questions as rhyming with Claudio Lobnitz's recent book on the Flores Magón brothers, a project that invites us to think of the Mexican Revolution in an expanded field that includes the United States. The case of Proust's Mexicans would lead us to analyze the 20th century debates about Mexican identity in an equally expanded field that would include Mexican exiles in Paris. To close, let me quote Freud's writing on the hypothetical godless Jew, a Jewish man who had abandoned religion but still claimed his identity as a Jew. Freud wrote, quote, "Were this man, the godless Jew, asked, now that you have renounced all these common traits of your people, religion, tradition, what remains Jewish about you?" This godless Jew would reply, "Indeed, a great deal, probably the very essence of Judaism." End quote. Could we not reach the same conclusion about these Mexicans in Paris, especially those like Lagándara and Ramón Fernández, who were born in France and never set foot in Mexico? What remains Mexican about them? Perhaps a great deal, perhaps even the very essence. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. Want the book now already, so we need the book. It's coming out now in April or June. Mm-hmm. So we'll be online for that. I had maybe one question but it has lots of little pieces because it's not very well formulated yet. I was thinking when you're talking about Paz, the Pachuco, the limit of Mexican, the dissolution of Mexican nationality at the limit or its obdurate nature. That it's possible that sort of France was to the United States a little bit like early liberalism in Mexico was to Porfirian positivism, in the sense that the early liberal generation had this and not just in Mexico, also in Brazil, places like that, early liberal generations had, I think, the image of, and Cuba too, the image of using liberalism as something that really could, at a certain point, overcome the depth of the civilizational gap. I think they would have called it civilizational gap rather than racial gap. So people like Juarez or all of these, Ignacio Ramirez, that kind of generation of the mid-19th century, that were liberals and that saw liberalism as a way of acceding to civilization, that allowed them to transcend this origin. So Juarez, for instance, typically you have the fact that he doesn't speak of himself as, quote, an Indian anywhere. The only place where he makes some kind of reference to this is his letter to his, as far as I know, to the letter to his children, which he writes, practically on his deathbed. So, and he doesn't even say, I'm a Zapotec or something like that. So you have this early generation of liberals that includes a lot of, for example, indigenous people, I mentioned Ramirez, Juarez, but there are a number. And that dies down as modernization becomes important, and you get this really hardened racial divide, where it's very difficult really to move out of a racial category and be born speaking Nahuatl like Altamirano or Ramirez and end up being one of Mexico's most famous intellectuals. So in Paris, it seems to me from your description, that possibility of that integration, of that being adopted as a French musician or as a French painter or as a French existed. Whereas in the American context, around the discussion of the Pachuco, you don't actually have that. You have, you can vacate all content of Mexican culture from the Pachuco, from Paz's point of view, but you can't actually break the racial line here in the U.S. if you suit it. So I think that one of the really fascinating things about what you're saying is that, so let me say this other line on the Judaism side. I mean, the Jewish thing and the homosexual thing in Proust are happening at a time when you have, on the one hand, real hardening of those categories, right? The Dreyfus Affair, the clinical redefinition of homosexuality, and the hardening of the kind of whatever heteronormativity or whatever you want to call it is happening at that time. So on the one hand you have this, but on the other hand